Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I'm going to share with you my love affair for three mid-late 20th century Australian sculptors, Inge King, Norma Redpath and Margel Hinder. These are three sculptors that I've always just loved. So that is the main focus of this video, my love affair with these three great sculptors. But before I get onto that, Stuart Griffin over there at Stuart Griffin 101, he always has this wonderful wrap-up, and I thought maybe in tribute to the wonderful Stuart, I might give a little bit of a wrap-up as well. This is a bit of a tribute to the wonderful Stuart Griffin over there. So what have I been reading lately? As many of you will know, at the moment I'm writing the last chapter of my autobiographical verse novel, which will be called Hounded. And the umbrella theme, if you like, that's holding this last chapter together is the twin themes of death and bereavement. I have a history of bereavements in my personal story over the past 30 years. And so much of my autobiographical verse novel, as well as turning into a grand love letter to my beautiful Billy Blue, it is also a quite painful reflection on what it is to live with, depression and PTSD. So bringing all of these big themes to a conclusion in my last chapter is death and bereavement. So I've just done a reflection on the wonderful symphonies of Gustav Mahler, that wonderful German Jewish sort of late 19th century composer who I just love. Has any composer stood so closely to the open grave, and peered down to the coffin at the bottom? If anyone has composed the music, the soundtrack of death, it is Gustav Mahler. So I've just done a great reflection, if you like, on Mahler in this last chapter. And from Mahler, I went to a series of memoirs that I've been reading of those that have been forced to live with grief. So I've looked at Isabel Allende, that wonderful Chilean writer who I think now lives in California, doesn't she? And then, of course, there was the C.S. Lewis wonderful book, A Grief Observed, which he wrote after his wife, Joy Davidson, died of cancer, not long after they were married, of course. And then I've also looked at the great Jewish Welsh poet, Danny Abbs, who lost his partner of more than 50 years, joyful, happy marriage. His partner was snatched from him in a car crash. So I've been reading these memoirs by people who have been forced to live with grief and reflecting on what, the comparisons, if you like, to my own life and my own story of living with grief and the PTSD that I have lived with for the past 30 odd years. So it's been an interesting thing. But where I'm up to now with Hounded, I've just been looking at ghosts. Trying to keep things a little bit lighter as well. I don't want Hounded to be all, shade. I've got the light of my love letter to Billy Blue, of course, but I want more light and shade as well. So I've been just recently this wonderful series of YA novels. They're an absolute hoot of ghost busting. There's this detective agency, if you like, set up in London, and it's run by all these kids who are tracking down ghosts, because ghosts have been running rife through London, through the whole of the United Kingdom, in fact. And this is a wonderful, really sly comic sense of humour. They're just a lot of fun. I've been having an absolute blast reading these ghost-busting YA novels. There's a series of 5 of them. This just happens to be the first one, The Screaming Staircase. It's a great title, isn't it? Absolutely marvellous. And then, of course, I've been revisiting the wonderful Shirley Jackson, and I've been revisiting, of course, particularly The Haunting of Hill House. This is a novel I just love. So powerful, so atmospheric. So I've been reading The Haunting of Hill House as well, and then I did a video on this guy a few videos ago. If you're interested in watching it, I did a whole video featuring the work of this wonderful writer Irving Finkel. Irving Finkel is the keeper of cuneiform at the British Museum over there in London. He's another amazing Jewish scholar who's devoted his life to learning to read and translate cuneiform texts written on these clay tablets. The British Museum, of course, had thousands and thousands of tablets, most of them broken, of course, that need to be translated and shared with the world. So Irving Finkel's job now for 50 years has been to work in the British Museum, putting all these tablets back together again when they can, like a 3D jigsaw puzzle, and then, of course, translating the texts. And he's written this amazing book called The First Ghosts. And this is a real academic look at the way ghosts were imagined and lived with and treated in the Mesopotamian type context. So, ancient Iraq and ancient Iran. Particularly this book focuses on ancient Iraq with the ancient Sumerian and the ancient Akkadian or Babylonian and Assyrian peoples. This is an absolutely marvellous book. It's an absolute hoot. And I've had a lot of fun, looking at Hill House, The Haunting of Hill House, and the Lockwood & Co. series, looking at how they treat ghosts in the popular imagination through the prism of Irving Finkel. So I've been doing at the moment this wonderful treatise in my verse novel called Hounded on ghosts, and I'm having an absolute blast. I've had such a good time. I'm now about to move another shift of gear, if you like, and the next thing I'm going to be looking at in Hounded is the brand new Emily Wilson metrical verse translations of Homer's The Iliad. So that will bring this first part of my last chapter to a conclusion. Looking at the Iliad, there's not a text, is there, that has so much death. The Iliad is saturated in death. The rage of Achilles, living with bereavement is not always healthy. And when Achilles lost his great lover, the equally great Greek soldier Patroclus, he goes into this incredible rage, and he takes out, his bereavement is brought out through the body onto the battlefield, and he just slays hundreds and hundreds of Trojan soldiers. In particular, of course, the noble Hector, the great prince of Troy, the rage of Achilles. So bereavement is not always healthy. So that's what will be bringing this first part of this last chapter to a close. And then the final bit of my last chapter, which will be focused on quest. I'm going to begin, of course, by looking again at Homer and, of course, what else? The Odyssey. So I will again look at the brand new Emily Wilson metrical verse translation of the Odyssey as I begin that last section. So I'm really excited about Hounded. Bringing it to a close like this, I'm so close to an end now. I'm pretty sure I will have Hounded finished by the end of this year. So I'm hoping it will come out next year. And I'm really excited about it. It's really been holding things together for me. Talking about holding things together, what do you think of my Guernsey? This is the Guernsey of my precious Penrith Panthers, my wonderful Penny Panthers. When we first entered the National Rugby League competition back in 1967, this was the Guernsey that Penrith first wore. And being brown like this, we very quickly were sledged by all the other teams as being the chocolate soldiers because we always wilted under pressure. Our defence never stood the firm touch. we just were, we won lots of wooden spoons in those early years. We were the easy beats of the competition, but they were my local team and I just loved them to bits. So this was the first Guernsey that the Penrith Panthers wore in that competition. The chocolate soldiers. And of course that is an allusion to World War II. In World War II, at the end of the closing stages of the war, as the Japanese were moving down right through Southeast Asia, and they basically conquered all of Southeast Asia, hadn't they? And they were right, at Papua New Guinea, just to the north of Australia. And so Australia introduced conscription, and all these young men were conscripted into the army and sent to PNG on the Kokoda track to try and halt the Japanese advance, because there was so much fear in Australia at that time that we were next, that Japan had its sights not only on all of Asia, but then it would move down into Australia as well. And the chocolate soldiers illusion, of course, these soldiers who were conscripted into the army and sent to the Kokoda track, they were known as the chocolate soldiers because they too, like my penny panthers, would melt under pressure of the Japanese advance. So unfair criticism, because of course the chocolate soldiers went to Kokoda and in fact did halt the Japanese advance. Parts of Australia, northern Australia, were bombed by the Japanese, but the Japanese never launched an invasion force into Australia, into any part of Australia. So the advance was halted in PNG, and that was largely by these chocolate soldiers. So I'm wearing this wonderful Guernsey. Some of you might be wondering, I did say that last Sunday we played the Brisbane Broncos in a preliminary final and we lost that game. So maybe I'm also wearing my chocolate soldier Guernsey in a little bit of grief. We did just lose the rugby league. We are now knocked out of the competition, but there's always next season. So I'm wearing this wonderful Guernsey. The brown of the Guernsey also, of course, takes me back to my beautiful brindle boy, my beautiful Billy Blue. He is going well. He's still limping a little bit. There is still an infection in this toe that's being very stubborn. My vet is really keen not to operate again. I don't think Billy would like that at all. He really struggled with that experience. So we're really hoping that we can deal with the infection just with anti-inflammatory and antibiotic medication. And he might be on the antibiotic medication for another month or so, because as I said, he is still limping. It's a really stubborn infection. There is obviously something still in the toe. The problem is whatever is in the toe, it's organic. So it's not showing up in x-rays like glass or gravel would, of course. So the vet is really, when they go into the paw, they're really looking, quite blind. They've got no idea where that is because there's no marking or opening where there's a wound or anything. It's unusual. The vet is really not sure what the cause of this infection is. He is an old dog, of course, but I'm desperately hoping I've got another year or two with him. So we'll see how we go. But my poor boy, he's not vomiting at least, so he is coping with the medicine quite well. But all his poops have turned to, of course, a liquid mess. The antibiotics and the anti-inflammatories are playing havoc with his poor system, my poor boy. So he is a little bit run down and he's feeling a little bit sorry for himself. Oh, my poor boy, I just love him to bits. All right. Let's get down to the purpose of this video. Norma Redpath, Inge King, and Margel Hinder. These incredible sculptors. Australian sculpture through the 20th century was a very conventional, a very conservative affair. Going right back to the colonial periods in the 19th century as well. Most sculpture was, of course, done by men, about men. Most public sculpture that was being paid for by governments and, benefactors and what have you, it was about celebrating men, whether they be explorers or old governors, sometimes writers like Banjo Paterson or Henry Lawson. But predominantly the sculpture being done in Australia was very conservative, very conventional, life-size, bold celebrations of male achievement. And of course it was all in bronze and then located in great gardens, sometimes outside Parliament type buildings as well. So most of that period, it was very, very, very conservative. There was some sculpture being done in the earlier 20th century, also recreating, reimagining Greco-Roman, stories, mythology, if you like. But most of the sculpture in Australia was just very tedious, very conventional stuff celebrating the achievements of men, mainly explorers. But in the mid-20th century, things started to change. And, world sculpture also, I guess, was always maybe a little more conservative than painting. I think the problem with sculpture, of course, is that because of its size, it often has to be shown either in a public garden or in a big national type gallery. And of course, if you're sculpting in bronze, which is what everybody wanted for their sculpture, because we had this real love affair with the bronze sculpture, always, didn't we? And of course, bronze is very expensive. So not only because of its scale, but because of its materiality as well, it was a very expensive, difficult medium. And so if you needed great benefactors to make your sculptures, there was a lot of pressure, I think, on sculpture to remain very conservative and conventional, celebrating the achievements of men for many, many years. And it wasn't until the early mid-20th century that things started to really loosen up, like things had in other areas of the fine arts. So you have such wonderful sculptors, of course, as Alberto Giacometti living in Paris, that incredible Swiss-born sculptor who I just love. And then, of course, in the UK, there were incredible sculptors like Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth. These amazing sculptors that really opened sculpture up to getting away from the super realistic portrayal of the human form and opening things up to more organic and, different ways of imagining. And then, of course, Henry Moore was more organic, I guess, still looking at the figure. But people like, as was Alberto Giacometti, that real existentialist sculptor, really trying to get at angst in a sculptural form. But then, of course, people like Barbara Hepworth in the UK, she really opened sculpture right up to much more abstract forms. And she did a lot of work, not only looking at organic forms, but of course looking at spheres and all sorts of things. And then these changes in sculpture finally made their way to Australia. And it was really Norma Redpath, Inge King and Margel Hinder who really led the charge to open Australian sculptural practice up and do something different. And of course, they moved away from bronze, of course, as well. They just couldn't afford the bronze. So these three female sculptors were really opening up and doing a lot of work with sculpture with solder iron, with soft fuse and wire, in stainless steel, and of course, a lot of work in stone and also in wood. So they were really looking at materials that were much cheaper, much easier to get than bronze, so that you could be more innovative and more experimental. And they did smaller works that could be shown in, private spaces. And then finally, they were getting commissioned to do really grand major works in public gardens and the public galleries and all that sort of thing. So the sort of thing they came up with, here's Margel Hinder. Margel Hinder was an incredible Jewish migrant to Australia in that early mid-20th century milieu. She's actually a Sydney sculptor. Absolutely marvellous work. Here's a lovely, there's some more work by Margel Hinder. You can see the sort of thing she came up with. This one is in timber. Margel Hinder particularly favoured timber as a material for her sculptural practice. She did a lot of work in timber because, of course, you could just find it in the bush and bring it home, and then you could set about doing your work. There's a lovely portrait of Margel. Beautiful, isn't it? Oh, you're going to have to excuse all my coughing and spluttering. In the southern hemisphere, of course, we are in spring, so I'm actually feeling a bit crook. I'm feeling a bit sorry for myself. My hay fever is going crazy. But here again, a beautiful sculptural form. Margel Hinder really loves sculpting the female form, particularly the Madonna and Child, and you can see that really organic, beautiful use of curves, beautiful softness, but that's the sort of thing she carved with wood. Oh my goodness, this one, the Madonna and Child, Mother and Child. This is a much loved sculpture in the Art Gallery of New South Wales up there in Sydney. It is a much loved, beautiful sculpture. I will look a link down below if you want to have a look at that sculpture in a little bit more detail. Here's another beautiful sculpture by Margel. You can see she says absolutely marvelous. She really enjoyed sculpting the human form in wood, but she moved right away from looking at a super realist type sculpture. She wasn't interested in that type of naturalism of Rodin, if you like. She was more interested in not abstract sculpture so much, still looking at the human form, but she was interested in opening her practice up to different ways of imagining what the form could be. Here's one for me, the depressed male. I have spent a lot of time, I must admit, looking at that particular sculpture. You really can see the poor bloke is down on his luck, isn't he? Here's a lot more abstract type stuff that Margot did when she really opened things up to look with making sculptural practice with solder and wire. Really interesting, some of the work she started to come up with. Here's a marvelous, look at that, in solder and iron. It's called Thistledown, and it's an amazing sculpture. It almost has that organic softness about it of something that's actually living, but it's actually sculpted into metal and fuse wire soldering. It's an astounding piece. It's one of my favorite sculptures, that one. Absolutely marvelous, I think. There's another lovely portrait of Margel at the end of her life with her husband. Her husband, Frank Hinder, was also a painter. So they were both wonderful artists living there in Sydney. I don't have any books that I can show you, unfortunately, on Norma Redpath, I'm sorry. Norma is probably the least well-known of these three women sculptors, unfortunately, and I just love Norma Redpath, but I've never been able to find a proper monograph with all her works photographed. So I will do a link down below with some work that you can have a look at by Norma Redpath if you want to have a look at her work. But Norma Redpath's a Victorian painter, and she's just wonderful. She should be celebrated much more than she is. There's a wonderful portrait of Inge King. Inge King is a very high profile. She passed away, I think, a few years ago. There's a portrait of the young Inge King. She's another Jewish migrant who migrated to Australia in the mid-20th century after World War II, of course, or just before. I think it was just after World War II she migrated to Australia. She became a really major, a very, very important Australian female sculptor. This is the great monograph on Inge King that I've got. This is a wonderful book by Sasha Grishin. This is the major work really celebrating the sculptural practice of Inge King. You can see the work here in stainless steel. This is one of her most famous sculptures. It's the sort of thing she came up with. She did use bronze a little bit, but very rarely. Nearly all of her sculptural practice is in stainless steel. Look at that, amazing. That's a beautiful piece that's in Canberra. Look at that. Look, going back again, the rings of Saturn. It's just an astounding sculpture in stainless steel. Monumental work, polished stainless steel. Oh, I just absolutely love. There's a beautiful thing in her home that she built outside her workshop, if you like. So that's in the garden of her home in country Victoria. Some more beautiful photographs of her house and the workshop that she had where she did all her sculptural practice. As I said, Margel Hinder, here she is at work in her workshop doing some sculpture. She is a really, really major Australian sculptor, much, much loved. And she got, fortunately, in the middle part of her career and at the end of her career, she did get many commissions to do major sculptural work in both Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, all over the place. She is a much loved, you can see there, quite abstract sculptor. Here's a piece that's outside the National Gallery of Victoria, down there in Melbourne, Forward Surge. It's a much loved piece. In the gardens, just outside the National Gallery of Victoria. It's a beautiful work. There's another photograph of Forward Surge from a different angle. Beautiful. That's down in Melbourne, as I said. Here's the sort of thing she came up with as well. She also loved experimenting with colour with her sculptural practice. And as you can see, it's a very abstract sculptural practice, Inge King. She really opened sculptural practices right up. Here's an incredible mandala. She loved sculpting the mandala, that sphere, if you like, or the circle. It's a beautiful sculpture. And then she also really took to sculpting in a more abstract form birds, and trying to suggest the movement, the agility, the beauty of birds through the use of line in sculpture. So here's a beautiful piece she did called Shearwater, which is, of course, a wonderful seagoing bird. Oh, here's the rings of Saturn again. I'll never get tired of showing you this. Oh, it's one of my most favourite sculptures of all time by anyone. Here's another beautiful piece, polished stainless steel. It's interesting, isn't it? You know, a sculpture has been addicted to bronze for so long, and in the public imagination, you know, after the great ages of stone, you know, the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, going into then the Neolithic, before we invented invented the metals, then we had a brief, you know, age of copper before the great age of bronze. And people forget, of course, in the Bronze Age, because bronze was quite expensive and difficult to work with, and you couldn't really do repairs and sharpening of tools, for example, in bronze. You had to just melt the whole thing down and completely recast, remake the tool. So in the, you know, right through the Bronze Age, there was still a lot of work, a lot of tools in stone. You know, the Stone Age continued, the Neolithic Stone Age continued right through the Age of Bronze. It wasn't really until we worked out how to smelt iron in the Iron Age, just before the time of the Romans, that things really got off the ground and got going with metals, of course. And of course, iron completely transformed everything, didn't it? You know, you could repair iron tools, you could sharpen iron tools, and it was very cheap, very easy to do. Easy to find, you know, easy raw materials. Iron ore was everywhere. So iron really just changed everything. And that's when the human population, of course, exploded, because iron tools completely transformed the way we did agriculture. So we've always had this craving, haven't we? This hankering for bronze. You know, going back right to the Bronze Age, when, you know, the finest axe heads, the finest swords were, of course, made of bronze. You know, bronze was this prized possession that, you know, most people in the daily agricultural field were still in the Stone Age, really. Bronze was this incredibly, you know, won by smelting copper and tin. And bronze has just always had this attraction, which is really interesting, in the public imagination. And so sculptural practice today still, you know, most sculptors today, they still want to work in bronze. It's when we have sculptors like this, we open things up into all these new materials. It's interesting, isn't it? Here's a poem I've written in my current collection called Cactus. It's a poem I've called Shout Out. This was a poem that was written during the first presidency of Trump. And it was when the National Gallery of Victoria down there in Melbourne had an exhibition focused on these wonderful women sculptors. So it was an exhibition of work by Norma Redpath, Inge King, and Norma Redpath Margel Hinder. There was a wonderful exhibition of the three of them. And this is a poem that I have written in response to going to the gallery there in Melbourne and looking at this wonderful exhibition. This is my love affair with Inge King, Norma Redpath, and Margel Hinder. My poem is called Shout Out. I am home, out of work, out of friends, besieged, though dreaming a day out, thumbing a lift through NGV guides whilst listening to the TV news. And in the US, it's midterms, and the Teflon comb-over shouts at Guardians now stuck. He's other fish to fry. I hate this imperfect vessel of a damaged God lifting indecency high. As Christians, some, my own family, rally against safe schools. Seeking haven, I surrender to the gravity of a symphony of sorrowful songs, a wholly bowed minimalism, moving stepwise downwards to folk drone and lament. A soprano's soaring supplication, breaching Gestapo cells, and I wonder, how would Trump handle her? It's almost Remembrance Day, and in the memorials, boys get all the work, a stampede of lesser gods and adolescent fantasies, where the slain are recruited, spread-eagled on their shields, and in gardens, potent, voracious fawns are hard at it, abandoned to Dionysian urge. In former times, the gang got bronze to work on men, explorers, generals, gods, whilst the odd hot Circe could be taken to vows at the altar and liberated, a nude water nymph waiting. Wanting exception, it was time in 1972, so the RAF commissioned Inge to rise through adversity to the stars with 3 ground stainless steel monoliths piercing Anzac Parade, machine polished Milky Way reflectors. But these open skies soon offended uniformed men who came down hard, medals blazing on their chests. In this reserve, precious is mail and bronze, but abstractionist measurement in new material, irresistible. Margel, Inge and Norma's velvety smooth finish of flat angled planes, their mobile cut of fuse wire and soft solder, all those truncated organic forms in ripe profusion of stone. Margel's tutelatory deity as mother and child carved from ironbark, Inge's stainless steel rings of Saturn. Now full growth is measured by Norma in a heavily furrowed, gender-neutral, bronzed dawn sentinel with Trump ballast shed. Now with Margel and Inge, she expressively textures beads of molten metal fashioned by her welder's arc and leaving iron exquisitely wrought like thistledown. Oh, my grand love affair with Norma, Inge and Margel. I'm forgetting everything today. I'm feeling crook with my hay fever. Thank you for joining me in this celebration of some wonderful 20th century, mid-20th century, late 20th century Australian women sculptors. Thank you for joining me, and bye for now.